Hey, what's going on, everybody? Back with another brew video. This one is a 5-color dungeon crawler commander brew. I did choose Esika, God of the Tree, as my commander. One of any color, 2 green. Vigilance, tap, add 1 mana of any color. Other legendary creatures you control have vigilance and tap, add 1 mana of any color. The real reason I'm playing her, though, is for Prismatic Bridge. 1 mana of each color for a total of 5. At the beginning of your upkeep, reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal a creature or planeswalker. Put that card onto the battlefield and the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. So if you have Prismatic Bridge out and you're able to get it out early, or especially if you're able to get it out early, this is a big time card for this brew because most of your creatures have ETBs, venture into the dungeon, take the initiative, and it allows you to go through the dungeons even faster. Which that's the name of the game with this brew. You want to complete one dungeon first as fast as you can because there's a lot of cards in here, especially with the take the initiative, but also with venture into the dungeon, where if you've completed a dungeon, you get some kind of crazy perk with that card. And I'll get more to that later. If you don't want to do 5 colors, I would recommend black, white, or green, or all 3. They seem to be the strongest when it comes to the dungeon, while red and blue seem to be the weakest. However, there are cards in red and there are cards in blue that you can run. But personally, I think black, white, green are the best ones. But I wanted to do 5 colors because I wanted access to everything. So, and I wanted to use the Esika. So that being said, there are 2 mechanics you need to pay attention to. One is venture into the dungeon and one is take the initiative. Now, venture into the dungeon means if you are not in a dungeon, you then choose one of the 3 original dungeons to go into once the venture into the dungeon mechanic is triggered. Those are Dungeon of the Mad Mage, Lost Mine of Phandelver, and Tomb of Annihilation. Those are the original 3, and you can only get to them with venture into the dungeon. The 4th one is Undercity, and you can only get into that one with initiative. That being said, once you are in a dungeon, it doesn't matter which one of the 4, take the initiative and venturing into the dungeon do the same thing in that they just advance you to the next room. So if I'm in Undercity where at trap, target player loses 5 life, and then I trigger venture into the dungeon, I do not get pulled out of Undercity and have to go into one of the original 3. I just move to the next room, archives, and draw a card. Same is true for these with initiative. Now, initiative is a lot like Monarch, if you're familiar with that mechanic. It is essentially just a token that you have on the board once it's triggered. Whenever one or more creatures a player controls deal combat damage to you, that player takes the initiative. So the other people at the table can venture into Undercity if they're able to take the initiative from you, which will probably happen at some point in the game. That being said, you run plenty of take the initiative ETBs in this brew, so you don't even have to attack or damage the person with the initiative to get it back. You just have to play a card that has ETB initiative. Now, whenever you take the initiative and at the beginning of your upkeep, you venture into Undercity. So already, if you're able to hold on to the initiative and you have Prismatic Bridge out, you're getting 2 dungeon triggers per turn before you've even started playing anything or even drawn a card. So that's initiative. That's venture into the dungeon. If you're confused, feel free to ask more questions in the comments if you want. For me personally, Undercity is the best one in my opinion. I think most people think that. And then out of the original 3, Dungeon of the Mad Mage is the best one. However, I do like to run Lost Mine of Phandelver as well, mainly early on because it allows me to scry real quick and then I can create a treasure token, which early on that treasure token is invaluable, especially in a 5-color brew. Tomb of Annihilation, you can do that one if you want to, but I would avoid doing this one because there's a card that I'll go over real quick. Let me disable tags. Ace of Iraq, the Arc-like. He's a black 3-mana zombie wizard. When Ace of Iraq enters the Arc-like, when Ace of Iraq, the Arc-like enters the battlefield, if you haven't completed Tomb of Annihilation, return him to its owner's hand and venture into the dungeon. So you don't have to, if you haven't completed Tomb and you're not in a dungeon and you play him, you don't have to play Tomb. For some reason, that's a common misconception with this card. A lot of people think if they're not in a dungeon, they have to enter Tomb, but you don't, unless you want to play Ace and have him stay on the board. Which, if you do that, then whenever he attacks, for each opponent, you create a 2/2 zombie creature token, unless that player sacrifices a creature. Most people will let you have the 2/2 zombie creature. But that being said, if you never complete Tomb and you always choose one of the other two out of the three, that's infinite dungeon triggers every turn, or however much mana you have. Play it multiple times a turn, and he always goes back to your hand. Then you can also play cards. I do have a sideboard here. I know there's not sideboards in Commander, but I just like to have it here for cards I've recently taken out or I'm contemplating putting in. But there's Alluring. A little bit pricey. It's $30 for an enchantment. You can probably find it cheaper a little bit, maybe somewhere, but any player may play a creature card with total casting cost 3 or less whenever he or she could play an instant and without paying its casting cost. So you get to play creature cards with mana value 3 or less at flash speed. But it does apply to any player, so that is a drawback. But that being said, if that is out there, you can play Ace, and as long as you don't do Tomb, that is infinite dungeon triggers during your turn. Or actually, during anybody's turn, because it has flash. There's also a couple other combos with him. You could run Bantu's Monument since he's a black card. It'll drop it down to 1, or it'll drop it down 1 to 2 mana, and then you can play Gwenna with that as well. Add 2 mana in any combination of colors, and then she gets untapped when you play a creature spell with power 5 or greater, which Ace is. So that's another infinite combo for him. Or you could do Rooftop Storm. You may pay 0 rather than pay the mana cost for zombie creature spells you cast. So that's why I would recommend not doing Tomb of Annihilation. Like I said, Dungeon's the best one out of the original 3. Lost Mine's not bad. And then Undercity's definitely the best out of all of them. I'm not going to go over each room, though. Feel free to look at them on your own. I just wanted to tell you which ones were my favorites. Already went over Esika, so I am running a few Planeswalkers in this brew. Eliwick is the only one I would say should stay in, but really you could remove all 4 if you wanted to. Like, say you're wanting to run more mana rocks or counter spells or removal, or I do have some dice roll cards in here. If you wanted to add more dice cards so it's more of a Dungeons and Dragons theme, then go for it. But I would recommend keeping Eliwick. Her +1 is venture into the dungeon. Her -7 gives you an emblem with creatures you control have trample and haste, and they get +2/+2 for each differently named dungeon you've completed, so that could go all the way up to +8/+8. And if you don't do Tomb, still +6/+6. Then I do have Kaya in here for the recursion and the -3 exile ability. And if you're able to get to her -7, the emblem's really good. Lolth I have in here for flavor, and I just like the card. Then Venser's good. His +2 is a flick spell for more ETBs, and his -8 gives you an emblem with whenever you cast a spell, exile target permanent. Let me enable tags real quick. I do run a lot of removal in this brew, and that's because the pod I play with, they run a lot of problematic cards. One guy likes to play stacks, one guy likes to play pillow fort, one guy likes to play planeswalkers, another guy likes to play combos. Like, we all have different decks, and all of our decks are mostly on the competitive side of casual. So I do like to run a lot of removal, and since I have access to all 5 colors, a lot of the removal in here is able to target a non-land permanent. I didn't want to be bound to, oh, I drew this removal for a creature, but I needed an enchantment removal. I like to just have the flexibility there. That being said, I do run some staples, like Path to Exile, that do just target a creature. I do have Counterspell in here. I do have Crop Rotation for mana balancing. I do have Rapid Vigor for protection. I have a few cards that double up your dungeon triggers. So Dungeon Delver is an enchantment with commander creatures you own, have room abilities of dungeons you own, trigger an additional time. Hama Pashar, room abilities of dungeons you own, trigger an additional time. Most people are familiar with Panharmonicon. Yarok the Desecrated as well. It's the same as Panharmonicon. If a permanent entering the battlefield causes a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, that ability triggers an additional time. But Yarok is just a creature. It's a 3/5 with Death Touch and Lifelink. Then you're going to want to hold on to the initiative as much as you can. That might seem like obvious advice, but there are some cards that pay off if you hold on to the initiative, like Amon. Ward 2 at the beginning of your end step. If you have the initiative, draw a card, draw another card if you've completed a dungeon. Then down here, there is Stephana at the beginning of your end step. If you have the initiative, create a treasure. Create 3 of those tokens instead if you've completed a dungeon. So holding on to the initiative, it's not very difficult really because there's so many ETBs in here, and all you got to do is do combat damage to somebody that has it. But, just a tip. Then as for the creatures themselves, as far as the venture and take the initiative mechanics, I do have 12 initiatives and 14 into the dungeon. Caves of Chaos Adventurer. When Caves enters the battlefield, you take the initiative. Whenever Caves attack, exile the top card of your library. If you've completed a dungeon, you may play that card this turn without paying its mana cost. So there you have the first, if you've completed a dungeon, like major buff. I guess Eliwick has one with the +2/+2, but it takes a little bit to get there. Caves is on the attack. If you haven't completed a dungeon, you can still play that card. You just have to pay the mana. From the Catacombs is Graveyard Recursion, and it's actually from any graveyard. It doesn't have to be yours, and then it also takes the initiative, and it can be escaped. Loot Dispute is an enchantment that has a few effects. So whenever Loot Dispute enters the battlefield, you take the initiative and you create a treasure token. If someone takes the initiative from you, then whenever you attack the player who has the initiative, you create a treasure token. And then Loud Ruckus, whenever you complete a dungeon, create a 5/5 red dragon creature token with flying. So it does not have to be a unique dungeon. It's anytime you complete a dungeon. So if you have a right board state and you're completing 2 or 3 dungeons a turn, you're also popping out 2 or 3 5/5 red flyers a turn. Passageway Seer, Lifelink. When Passageway Seer enters the battlefield, take the initiative, and then at the beginning of your end step, if you have the initiative, put a +1/+1 counter on Seer. Ravenloft Adventurer, ETB initiative. If a creature an opponent controls would die, instead exile and put a hit counter on it. Whenever Ravenloft attacks, if you've completed a dungeon, defending player loses 1 life for each card they own in exile with a hit counter on it. Riltha Rail, Death Touch. When she enters, take the initiative. Whenever you attack, target attacking creature gains Death Touch until end of turn. If you've completed a dungeon, that creature also gets +5/+0, gains First Strike and Menace until end of turn. Starvox Tome. When Starvox Tome enters, take the initiative, tap, add 1 mana or 1 colorless mana. If you have the initiative, add 2 colorless mana instead. Take 3 of any color and tap the tome. Exile a card from the top of your library until you exile a non-land card. You may cast that card without paying its mana cost. Activate only if you've completed a dungeon. So clearly you want to complete a dungeon. Seasoned Dungeoneer, ETB initiative. Whenever you attack, target attacking cleric, rogue, warrior, or wizard gains protection from creatures until end of turn, and it explores. Tomb of Horrors Adventure is kind of expensive at 6 mana, but when it enters, you do take the initiative, and then also whenever you cast your second spell each turn, copy it. And then if you've completed a dungeon, copy that spell twice. You may choose new targets for the copies. Undermountain Adventurer, 4 mana with Vigilance. When Undermountain Adventurer enters the battlefield, you take the initiative, tap, add 2 green mana. But if you've completed a dungeon, add 6 mana instead. Vicious Battle Rager, ETB initiative. Whenever it becomes blocked by a creature, that creature's controller loses 5 life. And then White Plume Adventurer, ETB initiative. At the beginning of each opponent's upkeep, untap a creature you control. If you've completed a dungeon, untap all creatures you control instead. As for venture into the dungeon, I already went over Acer Arak. There is Borrowing of Clan Under. ETB, venture into the dungeon. Whenever Borrowing attacks, return up to 1 creature card with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield if you've completed a dungeon. Cloister Gargoyle, ETB venture. As long as you've completed a dungeon, it gets +3/+0 and has flying. Already went over Eliwick. Fate's Reversal is more graveyard recursion, but this one is only from your graveyard, and it does go to your hand, not the battlefield, but you do venture into the dungeon. Fly is a 1 mana enchantment. When enchanted creature, whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player, venture into the dungeon. It also has flying. Midnight Pathlighter, creatures you control can't be blocked except by legendaries. Whenever 1 or more creatures you control deal combat damage to a player, venture into the dungeon. So with that first mechanic of not being able to be blocked, the second mechanic triggers off of a player. So hopefully you're able to get in and hit 2 or 3 players at the table, and then that's 2 or 3 triggers off of 1 attack. attack phase, I guess. Nadar, Vigilance. When Nadar, Selfless Paladin, enters the battlefield or attacks, venture into the dungeon. Other creatures you control get +1/+1 as long as you've completed a dungeon. Radiant Solar. It is 6 mana, but it does have flying and lifelink, and it's a 3/6. And whenever Radiant Solar or another non-token creature enters the battlefield under your control, venture into the dungeon. So if you have the right board state out and you're popping out creatures with Prismatic Bridge, or you're hitting the payoffs of certain dungeons where you cast a creature without paying its mana cost, Radiant Solar can really get out of hand, because every creature that hits the board each turn, as long as it's not a token, triggers a dungeon. Then you could have something like Nadar out there that triggers on a dungeon on attack, and then you could also have Midnight Pathlighter. Whenever you deal damage, there's another trigger to venture into the dungeon. Then there's Thorough Investigation. Whenever you attack, investigate. Whenever you sacrifice a clue, venture into the dungeon. So you really can start going through the dungeon 2 or 3 times a turn and getting crazy buffs every time. Triumphant Adventurer, Death Touch, as long as it's your turn. Triumphant Adventurer has first strike. Whenever Triumphant Adventurer attacks, venture into the dungeon. So, I mean, if him and Nadar are both out there, that's 2 triggers when you attack. Varus, Silvery Moon Ranger, Reach, Ward 1. Whenever you cast a creature or planeswalker, venture into the dungeon. This one does trigger only once each turn. And then whenever you complete a dungeon, create a 2/2 green wolf creature token. Then I do have you find a cursed idol. You can either choose to destroy a target artifact, destroy a target enchantment, or create a treasure token and venture into the dungeon. A couple of enchantments I have untagged. I do like Bloodchief Ascension for this deck. It just makes it prolongs your life total, allows you to go wide and have a good board state, gives you a better chance of that because you're living longer. And then it also damages your opponents as long as it has the quest counters on it anytime a card enters their graveyard from anywhere. So pretty much anytime they cast a spell that doesn't stick to the board, like a permanent, obviously, they're losing 2 life, you're gaining 2 life. Black Market Connections is good for the treasure token, but also to draw a card or for a 3/2 blocker. Then I do have cards like Tempt with Discovery that does cost 4 mana, and it does allow your opponents to search for a land as well as yourself. However, if they search for a land, you get to search for an additional land. So if there's 4 people at the table, you get 4 mana or 4 lands, and they do come in untapped, and it can be any land. It doesn't have to be a basic. I like Binding the Old Gods because it destroys a non-land permanent, and then step 2, you can search for a forest. A little bit of mana rocks, that might be something you want to adjust if you play this deck. Maybe add some talismans, or if you have some higher end mana rocks, go with them. There's also things like Replicating Ring, Commander Sphere. I am running some dorks. Most of y'all are probably familiar with these, and being a 5-color brew, I wanted dorks that can tap for any color. Then there's Bloom Tender, which is definitely the best one in here. For each color among permanents you control, add 1 mana of that color to your mana pool. So it can tap for 5 mana. Delina Wild Mage is a dice card I have in here. She creates a tapped and attacking token whenever she attacks. That token is of a target creature you control. And if you roll 1 through 14, it does have exile this creature at end of combat, and that's the only one you create. However, if you roll 15 through 20, you create one of those tokens and then you roll again. So there's multiple ETBs there. Lae'zel's Acrobatics. I feel like I just said that like a redneck. Lae'zel. Exile all non-token creatures you control, then roll a d20, 1 through 9, return them to the battlefield under their owner's control at the beginning of the next end step. 10 through 20, you do that, but then you do it again. So you could use this as a way to get a lot of ETBs at once, and if you roll 10 through 20, it's going to be even crazier. Or you could use it as protection, and you're still going to get the ETBs when they come back. Like if it's somebody else's turn and they play a board wipe. That's pretty much it. Hope you enjoyed the video. Hope I didn't go through it too fast or get tongue-tied too often. Hope y'all enjoyed this, though. I'll have the deck list in the comments as well, so you can take a peek. And I know this deck says private up here, but I'll be removing that once I post the video. And that's about it. Hope you guys enjoyed. Happy New Year.